Casting.
That is a lot of broadcasting. Hi, I'm Brian O'Leary, and I'm joined today by Jean Kaplansky from Safari Books Online, as well as Iris Febres from she's the EPUB master who's known on Twitter as EPUB Pupil. Um, a few months ago, I wrote a post that asked the question, why do digital media startups attract investor capital at a time when traditional publishers are struggling in the market? And I made the contention that the answer may be operational. That is, that traditional publishing workflows are typically built for a single purpose, and that makes them difficult to adapt and to scale. I went on to actually outline 6 signs that you might have a workflow that won't scale. And I was happy to be able to get both Jean and Iris to join me today to talk a little bit about their experience as well as my own in working with publishers who have one or more of these problems and what they might be able to do about them. So welcome, guys, Iris and Jean.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The first of those 6 signs was essentially single-purpose legacy content management systems. What I wrote about at the time was that most publishers have optimized their workflows for print, and they still manage distribution to other platforms and purposes as follow-on steps, as separate processes. And that's an approach that doesn't grow cost-effectively. Does that mirror your experiences as well?
Jean, you want to go first or want me to?
Yeah.
I will start with Iris.
Yes. I've had encounters with publishers. So at Aptara, where I'm a solutions architect, I help publishers figure out their digital output. And a lot of the time, we'll get a product or a book, more likely, that wasn't really thought of in terms of its content architecture at the very beginning. That is at the acquisition stage, which I think is about the earliest that you can get in most of these processes, where the book made total sense for print because a lot of the elements within the book design-wise relied on the tactility of the physical product, the actual book with the spine and pages. But in order to translate into an electronic format, all of that essence, I guess so to speak, would disappear, and the content then wouldn't make sense within this new medium or context. So what I always try to recommend to publishers, which I've been met with, yes, we totally agree, but we have a long way to go to do that, or gritted teeth, like, yeah, I guess you're right, is that the content needs to be thought about and analyzed and put into place at the acquisition stage, thinking about the channels at the very end. It can't just be an afterthought. And I had one client who, not a client, but actually a friend who works at a publisher in the Boston area where they had a workbook, and so there were a lot of elements that needed like write-in segments, as if it was like a notepad. And they asked me, so what can we do in ebook? I'm like, well, you can't really do much unless you go to iPad and you have, JavaScript that will cache the content that a person will type in the iPad. Well, where's that supported? iBooks? Maybe Medium, probably. And of course that answer was not as satisfactory as they would like. And I told them, you guys needed to had to have thought about that when you were acquiring and figuring out how the book was going to look. So the earlier you can start in terms of planning your content for multiple outputs, the better. Before it even gets into InDesign, before it even gets into Word, having those conversations early, looping in a developer, looping in your production people in the acquisitions process, is something that I recommend. And it's something that I think has been getting a lot of traction, especially in the ebook production community. I know that Laura Brady, a big ebook guru, has been advocating for, letting the developer into those meetings and talking about that kind of work as early as possible in the process. So, Jean, I'm sure you've had similar experiences when we worked together and possibly when before we met.
Yes, actually, I would say that last one where you had the publisher who wanted a workbook, I would have immediately told them this isn't a book, it's an app. So I can speak about this from a couple of different perspectives. So there's the ebook perspective of everything is designed for print, and then they think about ebooks, and then they're like, oh, well, how do we make this into an ebook? And everybody wants to do a fixed layout of what Joe Weicker refers to as print under glass. And obviously that's not what ebook technology is about. And so a lot of storybook or storyboarding has to happen from the very point of acquisition, working with the author to make an effective ebook. On the journal side of things in scholarly publishing, the big interest right now is starting to be in interactive objects and swappable data sets that you can put into journal articles. And this is an even more difficult prospect because the journal workflow for authoring and peer review is completely not set up to accommodate this kind of production at all. Usually with journals, you have the author who submits to peer review goes through, editor chooses the article, and that's all the author has until it gets published. So the idea of going back to the author to do interactive objects in their paper is a very, very nascent idea to most journal publishers at this point. And the other thing I see is a lot of flip-flopping in workflows. So you have a print workflow and you try to bolt on something for E, and that doesn't work. So you try to bolt something else on, and that doesn't work. So, I mean, you just basically keep throwing stuff at it, and you wind up with a really, really big mess.
Yeah, I think the consequence of the situations that you're describing, both Iris and Jean, are in effect that it becomes really expensive to create an ancillary product. I mean, you remember it's not so much the ebooks are old, but the between 2007 and perhaps 2012, so the first 5 or 6 years of predominant use of ebooks after the Kindle was introduced. Most publishers said it's just so expensive. They were debating whether or not to release ebooks simultaneously. They said it took time. It was much more expensive. It was a totally separate process, and they've begun to kind of get that down in the last 3 years, so that you can support simultaneous release of print and digital formats. But I don't think we've really figured out what those digital formats should be like. And if we added 2 more, 3 more, 4 more formats, which we are really, Jean, your examples are really good. As we add those formats, the cost of actually keeping things up is way too high. It has to go back to Iris's conception of what is it that you're trying to do with this content from the time that you create it.
Exactly, and I can tell you that one of the things that's really big right now is that people are starting to think mobile first. I mean, this is how it is on the web right now. Everybody's thinking mobile first, and lots of publishers, like lots of the big publishers, the education publishers, are also starting to think mobile first. And that just turns existing workflows on their heads because they're not ready. They haven't planned, and they're going to really have to deconstruct the print workflows that they've got, and then do the requirements and the roadmap and the implementation to actually flip it to a mobile first approach where you can also get print out the back end. So that's going to be a few years in the making. one of the things that I have seen a couple of different things right now with ebooks is one, they're no longer new and exciting. They've been commoditized. They're fairly easy to make. People understand the technology for creating an EPUB now. And even if they don't understand the technology for creating an EPUB, they can get an EPUB out of InDesign, or they can get an EPUB out of iBooks, Author even. And this causes a bit of an issue for production workflows because it's so easy to create an EPUB these days. People think that the workflow, even for mobile, is a lot easier than it really is. The fact of the matter is, when that packaged ebook goes to a rendering engine, it gets disassembled and it's going to be displayed as HTML. And all of the reading apps out there do things just a little bit differently. So it's something that I'm very concerned about what happens when we start getting iBooks Author EPUB 3s. Will we be able to ingest those into Safari? I don't know. I haven't seen one yet. And the InDesign EPUB is kind of all over the map. They went really all out for fixed layout, and it's so complicated as to be something that you can't maintain without going back to the original InDesign.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come to this in a minute when we talk about replica or single-purpose content, but you know, fixed layout is a good example of, in many ways, the remnants of a legacy CMS, which is we've made this for print, and we think that this should be the canonical representation of the text. So let's figure out a way to do it. And there's this pervasive impact of having a legacy CMS in place. Clay Shirky, Emily Bell were writing about newspapers in particular. And when they did the research, this is about 2 years ago, when they did the research with local and medium-sized newspapers, the single complaint that virtually every reporter had was, we really want to do different journalism, more interesting presentation of content, but our CMS prevents it. And it prevents it in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes it doesn't have the functionality to do short form or a quick post. Other times the hierarchy is built in, essentially the approval hierarchy, the workflow is built in, so you can't just write something and publish it. It has to go to 2 or 3 or 4 other people. And the CMSs that we have as well are built that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing about the CMSs at this point is, I mean, there are some CMSs that are designed for doing newspaper articles and pushing content out very quickly. Django is one of those that started off in the newspaper world, and that's more of a framework than anything else. But when you start talking about that, you really are going back to the author who has to actually come up with this content and think differently about the content. And it's hard for publishers to understand that they have to include so many different people in the workflow now. It's something they're not used to doing. They're very used to having things thrown over the wall. The other thing that most publishers have done is if they haven't gone with not necessarily off-the-shelf software, but like a big enterprise application like Documentum as their CMS, which has its own limitations. A lot of the publishers went and built their own CMS, and I can say definitively that the idea of better built here that some publishers have taken with their IT teams does not necessarily apply. They wind up with CMSs that either don't meet business requirements or are very limited in the business requirements that they do meet, especially if they're trying to take an agile approach where they add a little functionality, add a little bit more functionality, add a bit, and things are constantly iterating.
Sure. Iris, you've been nodding. Is there something you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, I was like, you're thinking about O'Reilly, aren't you, Gene? in terms of the.
No, actually, I'm not thinking about O'Reilly.
Which one?
I'm not. No, I'm not. Well, I don't think it's fair to mention any specific publisher by name.
That's true.
But I know it's true that there has been a better built here philosophy from publishers.
It's just
And that's why they've built their things. They've built scripts. They've built various things where they've hired somebody, a freelancer, to build a script, and now the freelancer can't even read his own code. It's very limited. It's clunky, and it doesn't meet requirements.
my concern is about maintenance then, though, because yes, you get a lot more control when you build your own CMS, which, I can only imagine would cost, X thousands of dollars, man hours, and development time, and dedicated expertise that, may be hard for a publisher to procure and scale. So does it make more sense for a publisher to build their own CMS from scratch, or, do a lot of homework and work with one of the larger players to deliver a solution to them that's tailored for their needs?
Well, I think in the experience I've had, which and part of it is outlined by the assignments we get. So we get experiences that are not necessarily the same or different. But the experience I've had in terms of the more you whether you buy it or build it, the more you customize the solution, the harder it becomes to actually adapt. And this is particularly true if you're taking an existing system and then saying, well, that's not the way we do it. It makes it harder. The next format in is not going to be supported. And a lot of IT projects they start by saying, tell me what my endpoint needs to be, because that's how you do time and materials and everything else. And once you do that, you're not open to the third thing that might come down the pipe. That becomes like. Go ahead, Jean.
Oh, I was going to say, I was going to provide an example of this, which is I worked for a company at one point that merged with a whole bunch of other companies, and when they finally did the the database count, they figured out that across all the sites across the world, they had 36 different Documentum instances at various versions of Documentum. And it happened to be that the site I was working with was one of the very first Documentum customers ever. And so they had built a lot of functionality with Perl scripts. And they built it on, and they built it on. And then as they were doing this, Documentum was rolling a lot of these features back into the product. And when it came down to it, we did the analysis. Out of the 36 Documentum instances that we had, my site couldn't update Documentum. It would break everything that they had. They have basically painted themselves into a corner.
Yeah.
Yeah. So unless you make the wholesale change, you can't do anything really.
Yeah. And people really want to be more iterative and agile at this point. I mean, we're talking about agile authoring and agile business, which means they want to be able to do things like continuous delivery and be able to do iterations on the fly. And that's the pace we're moving at these days, and publishers are not moving at that pace yet.
Yeah,
or most publishers, I should say. Some of them are, but not most.
Maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about the second thing that I thought was a warning sign. That's multiple incompatible metadata schemas and systems. In particular, looking at a publisher that has multiple units that handle metadata in its own way, or not following standard approaches. So much so that systems can't talk to one another. That you have an e-book system, you have a print book system, and then when you try to look across the entire business, it's impossible. You have to gather data by hand or in some sort of spreadsheet formats.
Yeah, that's a big one. The thing about the metadata thing is that until Dublin Core came along and the various other ontologies and metadata schemas, people made it up for their own business requirements. And a
Yeah.
lot of it was repeated across companies, but a lot of it was very specific to companies. In fact, some companies had it so specific that it made it so they could make a decision about, okay, we've built all this metadata into our proprietary DTD, and now we're stuck. We can't really go to another system without building more metadata into our DTD. So the care and feeding of schemas and metadata is something that is also needs to be planned from a very early point. People are in a rush to implement, and a parable that has followed me around for the last 20 years is the sooner you start, the longer it takes. And
Can I
with
write that
regard
down?
to implementation,
I'm gonna write
yes,
that down.
absolutely. I'm not the person who coined it, but I heard it about 20 years ago, and it's true. If you don't do your homework, if you don't figure out what your business requirements are, and then go and find the proper tools, it's kind of the I have a hammer, so everything's a nail syndrome. If you don't find the proper tools to meet your business requirements, you're going to paint yourself into a corner one way or another. And you have to be prepared to think about, hey, if you're taking this on, you're also taking on the care and feeding and maintenance of this system for however many years or iterations it's going to go through before you move on to the next. And that is a big deal right there, because publishing companies move from one system to the next system. The first system doesn't work, so they throw it out and they try something else. So they throw it out and they try something else. We're just getting to the point right now where publishers are coming to the realization that, and this is where EduPub comes in from the IDPF. Publishers are coming to the realization that most of the mobile or digital output that they want to do is going to be based on HTML5. And it's a simple fact that the less you transform your content, so the less iteration you put your content through in terms of transforms and conversions, and the less people who touch the content, the more the content is going to be accurate. Because every time a human touches content, you basically wind up with a chance for human error to be introduced. So a lot of publishers are starting to look directly at doing polyglot HTML5, which is basically XHTML5, an XML rendition of HTML5, restricting markup patterns specifically for their content, has resulted in the EduPub working with in the EduPub specification from the IDPF. So it's a industry-specific thing, and there could very well be other industry-specific things that come along and start using HTML5 markup in a similar way. And
Yeah,
this is a fairly new thing, because publishers have known about XML for a while now, and they've known about DTDs for a while now, and they all had their opportunity to take DocBook and make it into their own company ML, and that's what they did. Now we're starting to see some companies who are throwing out their company ML and actually moving right to XHTML5 markup patterns with very strict business rules about how those patterns are used and when they're used. So
yeah, I
this
agree.
is an interesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was going to say I agree with you. It's one of the reasons that I try to. I've written on a number of occasions about the importance of publishers both being aware of and getting involved with the W3C, because
Exactly.
as HTML goes, so goes publishing.
And this, there's kind of a double edge here, because last year I went to a consortium that was XML and HTML5. Can't we all just get along? And the facilitator happened to be Robin Bergeon, who's the editor of the W3 HTML5 specification. I think we waited until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the old school XML people started in on the, hey, you kids, get off of my lawn, we're going to do XML forever. Not realizing that, it doesn't work that way anymore. You have to move forward. And if somebody has an idea about doing something different, people should not be so locked into but this is the right way. People should be willing to experiment with things because that's how you discover what works and what doesn't work.
So how do publishers learn HTML5?
Aren't you the EPUB pupil?
There are lots of resources out there in the world, and actually there's one from O'Reilly that's called, I believe, HTML5 for Publishers. Very, very short, free little book that talks about core, fancy HTML5 elements that publishers can leverage to make some really engaging interactive content. I think a core tenet, at least on the production side, and I know that this can transfer over to editorials, that you can't be afraid of code. Code isn't that scary, especially since, as you said, Jean, that publishers are familiar, at least with XML for the most part, and the structured nature that is XML. HTML5 is the same has that same sort of mechanic where there's a vocabulary and content should fit into that vocabulary. The question is, who assigns the value of that content within that vocabulary? I think that's something that needs to be decided upon internally after a bit of discussion to figure out, what does that hierarchy look like? Since there may be a couple of elements in the HTML5 spec that could be open to interpretation. I would say like article or section used within EPUB. What does that mean? Who would decide that? I would think it would be something editorial would configure, but editorial doesn't dabble in code as much as, I guess, production would.
And I don't even think it's a matter of having editorial dabble in code, because production can dabble in code, but they have to include editorial in the conversation.
Yeah.
They have to absolutely include the development editors. And so the best way to learn HTML5 for publishers is to get directly involved. Feet first, join the W3, go to the meetings, get involved. This has been an issue that I've seen. There is a digital publishing interest group that is a chartered group for the W3, and it needs more publishers. It needs more publisher input.
Yeah.
It needs more journal publisher input. It needs more STM publisher input, and it needs more trade and professional publisher input. That's just the fact of the matter. The other thing that I see is when we did the EduPub working group, when we started it, we actually started with an example that was given to us by Pearson of what they were doing with the HTML5 markup. And then O'Reilly spoke up and said, well, we're doing stuff with HTML5 markup too. And so we had their model to work with. And then Wiley came into the picture, and we had just finished a very extensive HTML5 markup pattern template for use for technical professional books. And so there were markup patterns there as well. Reconciling all those markup patterns is basically what became EduPub. So there was publisher input on the IDPF side. a lot more publisher input, I think, than we've had before. Um, but we can still do better. We need publishers to really kind of be more involved with the IDPF and more involved with the W3 than with, oh, say, like the AAP or even for the BISG. And the BISG itself is a member of the W3, so I mean they're keeping up with the times. But publishers really need to have people kind of cross the board for these organizations, because it's not what they're doing right now, it's what they're going to do. Right. And that is where they're going to learn.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, publishers have always been doing markup. I mean, identifying heads, body type, etc. What's happening here is akin to, this is probably the advantage of being old, or at least older, is having gone through that era when desktop publishing was first introduced, and everybody says essentially, well, it was going to that was the thing before this that was going to ruin publishing. And of course, what it winds up doing is giving publishers tools that compositors once had. And I think what HTML does is give publishers tools that compositors as well as distributors once had, and opens up a wider span of things that products that they can offer, markets that they can reach, but they have to understand the tools. So I'm going to turn to one that you go ahead. No, that's fine.
No, go. Let's move on.
Okay. I'm going to turn to one that I think Iris will really like, which is the third warning sign is replica or single-purpose static digital content. I know. And my favorite example are the books, the digital books, ebooks that are put out that have really extensive indices, none of which are linked to the book itself. So you get to look up, and worse yet, the ones that still have the page number. And the compromise in a lot of cases is just to drop the index, which is just really sad.
It is sad. So where do I start with replica content?
How about we can do better?
Yeah, we can do better, and we have to make concerted efforts to not be married to print design. I know it's beautiful. I've seen some very gorgeous print books, and I've seen many gorgeous print books that do not require to be digitized. It just doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint. It doesn't make sense from a consumer standpoint. That experience cannot be successfully replicated while maintaining the integrity of the original print product. I was actually talking with a publisher this week who was noticing that with some of their titles, the devices for Amazon that they can select to download the content to, they were comparing that to a competitor title, and I noticed that the competitor title had more devices available to them for downloading a sample or downloading a book with like a one-click purchase on Amazon. So when I did some research, I realized, the competing title isn't fixed layout, it's reflowable. And so when you have a reflowable text, it's going to be more accessible to different platforms. So I'm still working through what their options are in terms of how they can reinterpret the design, but the publisher is still in the right mindset where they told me point back, there's no way that we can do certain things as reflowable. And I can only imagine why until I start digging into their content, like what's going on in terms of, and I know that the content revolves a lot around like crafts, interior decoration, and stuff like that, where it's very photo heavy, but the designers include a lot of columns and graphics and diagrams and so forth. I gave a recent presentation for a class at Emerson where I did my master's, and I kind of brought it back from the dead in a recent e-production hour where I talk about storyboarding for fixed layout content, where how you identify those patterns and identify those markers that permeate throughout a book, so that you create anchors for the reader that wouldn't exist unless you had it in print. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunities for editors and designers to kind of reconceptualize their content so that they don't just have to export a replica, because that just shows how well they know their content and how well they understand it, to the point that they can transform it into a much more engaging experience. I always try to, when I go through the ebooks that I read, is it searchable? Can I highlight? I don't actually read a lot of books with indexes, unfortunately, but I would imagine that if I had a, particularly like for cookbooks, I would want a robust index that I can click through and have anchors to important aspects of the content. When I deal with fixed layout, it seems kind of more like I'm observing content rather than really engaging with it, and that's just my personal experience. So if there are ways that a publisher can engage their content and leverage it by translating it for a particular medium, because all these different mediums have different capabilities. The iPad can do X things, the Kindle can do Y-1 thing. There's so many opportunities, but that it takes some brainstorming and strategery to figure out how that content can be pushed to its limits, while at the same time future-proofing, so that when the devices do catch up in the marketplace, the content's ready to go and can explore, I guess, that new frontier without sounding too cheesy and terrible. But
I have a couple of points to interject here, because one is, a lot of the time with publishers, they've never seen it in reflowable, so they don't know that it can be done in reflowable. But if you show them an example of something that they think can't be reflowable as reflowable, they have an aha moment. That's one point right there.
Yeah, it's a good point.
The second point is that we went through this when Stan Sigmund from Wiley and I did the Wiley EPUB template. We tested that template on about 24 different devices, apps, across the board. And so what we came down to is there's a concept, web concepts. Two. One is graceful degradation, and the other one is progressive enhancement. And there is a huge argument about which one is better. But we went for a little of both, so that when we hit the Kindle DX, that it worked as well as it was going to work on a Kindle DX. But that when we had the full-blown Radium or the full-blown iBooks with more EPUB 3 support, that it worked well on those particular platforms as well. So a lot of that was done behind the scenes, media queries. There's a lot of CSS that publishers don't know about that's going to control a lot of what this content does in the future. And that is a completely different conversation.
Yeah, no, but it's an important one. Maybe on the next Google Hangout. The
Yeah.
one of the other things that I put down as a warning sign, it's something I think that Safari Books Online is actually been very good about addressing, is the tendency of publishers to organize content in silos, so that it's relatively narrowly defined and often in ways that only make sense to the publisher. And I think it's not unique in this regard, but I think Safari Books Online has been working to break down some of those barriers and make content more accessible to its users.
I agree. I haven't been with Safari very long, but I've been a Safari subscriber since 2006. So I have a pretty good idea of the history of the interface and how things have worked. And going from traditional Safari Books Online over to the new Safari, when the new Safari came out, it was an adjustment in thinking for me as a user, because it's designed for a different kind of user experience, and it's a good user experience, and which is basically you can look up pieces of content that you need, and you get them in a context that makes you really immerse yourself in that content at that moment. Whereas when you were in old print layout things, the layout could be distracting, or you wouldn't know where you were, or you would be navigationally confused due to art or icons, callouts. And so what I think the new Safari does really well is let you get immediately to chunks of content that are relevant to whatever it was that you were searching for. Another thing that Safari is doing right now is tutorials that are curated by people. So that's really important, and we've got quite a few tutorials out now. And a third thing that I think is really important is the concept of collections of content that are contextual and put pieces of content together that make sense together.
Yeah, I agree. Iris, have you seen examples where the silos got in the way?
I'm trying to think. I can't recall an example right off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think that it varies a lot by the experiences that we've had. One thing that was interesting, an assignment that dates back several years now for me. I had a client who wanted me to, or wanted a team of us to recommend a strategy for digitizing all of their intellectual property. The first part of that, the answer was, don't digitize all of your intellectual property, because it's very hard to justify that. I mean, there's some stuff that is purely because it's not, digitization is not preservation, and they were concerned about preservation in a number of cases. But digitization can be really good if there's a business model attached. But in the course of doing that, what we found was that we had to literally go office to office to find out where stuff was. And I can't, there's a really good anecdote that would go on too long, so I'll save it for another day. But at one point I asked the gentleman that I was interviewing, well, where would I find content for this particular series? And he turned around and reached back for like the folder, the boxes you put files in. There's a file folder box. He goes, oh, it's right here. And he pulls out the original Rubylith film and I said, well, that's just for reference. He goes, no, this is the film. And I said that, so that's a silo.
Yeah. There's a book out called The Paperless Office. It's a few years old. I think it might even be like 10 or 15 years old. But one of the examples they use is going through the Xerox PARC office out in California and just finding offices that were stacks and stacks and stacks of paper. And the people who had the stacks knew where to find things in the stacks, but nobody else had a chance. So there's a difference between archiving content, records management, the content life cycle that goes with records management, when to retire content or get rid of content, and then digitizing content. When you digitize content, the best practice is usually to digitize the prioritized, we need this for some reason, content first. And then if you find that you need other things, then you can kind of you bring them along into the new digitization concept as you go. Because it's expensive. One, you've got to build the system and make the system go, and the care and the feeding of the system. And the other part of it is that, again, with the records management and archival purposes, at some point, most companies do have to not only retire content, but actually get rid of it. And there has to be a plan that says what is the life cycle of this content. We can't just tomb it somewhere. We can't just digitize it all and tomb it into CMS. I've seen that happen. I've seen it, let's do the entire backlist, and it goes into a CMS and never gets touched again. That was a very expensive experience or exercise.
And I think it's the kind of thing that also is reflected in the public presence for some of that content, and that it just gets organized as the editor and or production person understood it, and not necessarily as a reader might look for it.
Right. And that's a big deal right there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I said that it's really good to try and keep an eye on is when you have limited or no use of data analytics, and I thought that both for content characteristics, which is kind of the thing we've been talking about, but also for user engagement. And I know, Gene, you've only been at Safari a short time, but I think this is an area they've really focused on to truly understand the engagement with content.
Yeah, Safari does have a really large business analysis team in informatics, and collecting a lot of the data and analyzing who's reading what and how much time they spend and how much of any one book people are reading. I'm sure there's probably other stats they have as well, but they spend a lot of time on this because it tells us what our users are doing, and it helps, along with interviewing users, it helps us make a user experience that the users want, as opposed to foisting a user experience upon them. There's been a lot of foisting a user experience upon people, and it's not the user experience that they either expected or wanted. I think Safari, especially with the new Safari, has gotten that really. They nailed it with how the user experience should be. At least for me, it lets me immerse myself in the content. It lets me find relevant content, and it lets me get stuff done that I need to get done.
Now, Iris, I think that you started out when we were talking about the first point, saying that you really need to plan how your content's going to get used down the road, and I think that's also the point when people should be thinking about what analytics, what information they want to collect to tell them whether or not they're successful.
Well, it's funny because in ebooks you can't really do that.
Not yet.
Not yet, and I don't know if, unless you make an ebook for the web, so having the publication either behind the paywall or some kind of credential that lets you access the content on the web, you're able to, inject whatever scripts or, monitoring mechanisms to gather that analytics. I actually had a publisher reach out to us about putting in some kind of script in the EPUB that would allow them to get some metrics as to who's reading what, how long they're on a page, or something else that's, very valuable information that are kept at the castles of Apple and Amazon and what have you. And we told them, you can do that, but Apple's going to find it and they're going to reject your book because that's what Apple does, and they keep that information. That's what Amazon does, and they keep that information. So I don't know if, I sincerely doubt that the retailers are going to let go of that grip on that data. They have their own prerogatives on their users, but it's in direct conflict with the relationship that publishers want to have with their readers, which I think is why, ever since that big Amazon drama with a major publisher, people have started thinking about how do we reach the users directly, and how do we reach readers directly so that we have that information already at our disposal that we can leverage in some way. I recommend that publishers should research a teensy tiny little bit into data science and big data and what big data is about and what the aims are. It's a big buzzword that keeps getting thrown around at different conferences, but there's still a lot of opportunity that can be leveraged, especially if you go straight to HTML5, because then the sky's the limit. You're on the web, you have control because it's so open, and that you're not limited to a particular retail space where the rules are set by the retailer and you don't have access to that user data at all. And I don't think it's ever going to be opened up.
It is and it isn't. So we have, the Amazons and the Apples who have their analytics and they track things. There are other people who are using Adobe DRM who are able to kind of track usage anonymously through, looking back at the records for the database. And Kobo has always been real upfront and telling everybody about what the data analytics they've collected are. But on the other side of things, we have education technology and education publishers. And a lot of education publishers have their own systems. They have their own, actual learning applications, or they have multiple systems where they can collect analytics. They're starting to look into adaptive learning technology and linked data, and that's going to lead to more analytics. So they are collecting analytics in that respect. It's what they do with those analytics that they haven't quite figured out yet.
Yeah, I hosted a panel for book business in March, and there's a group of publishers that were operating in the analytics space, and they all said essentially we're collecting and our analysis is limited, and they recognize that as a problem. I mean, they're open about it and positive, but I think we're just starting to get there.
Is that
they're collecting? They don't necessarily know what is relevant and what isn't relevant, and they don't necessarily have an idea of how to analyze it. And that's goes back to what Iris was saying about big data and finding patterns and recognizing the things that are important.
The last point I made is one that we're all too familiar with, and it actually harkens back to a point you made a couple of minutes ago, Gene. It's that the redundancies in production workflows, and in addition to being expensive, they slow you down, and as you point out, they increase the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake. One of the things I think that most people miss in process or workflow design is that the fewer steps you have, the more likely it is you're going to have a good result. I mean, the quality is not a function of having 17 people check it. It's really it's a function of having a well-designed workflow in which the right number of people check it.
Yes, absolutely. The fewer people who touch the content within a structured and we follow the rules workflow, the better off you're going to be in terms of quality and consistency. And even if you're trying for, like, everything must have a certain tone to it, or a style guide. Web style guides are big right now, in terms of writing styles. It really has to be less people rather than more people, and fewer transforms rather than more transforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's we're not there yet. And in fact,
Mm.
my go-to story is I used to say that I was dedicating my career to eliminating checking in the graphic arts, meaning that to have a process that actually delivered a result and delivered a result reliably. And not too long ago, somebody said, "How is it going?" And I said, "Well, I'm much more than half done, and it's not looking good." So, so I'm going to have to leave it up to you guys to carry the ball after me.
Oh, thanks.
We're working on
So,
it.
I mean, well, the redundancies piece is really important. I mean, the notion that you can format for print, and then format for web, and then format for tablet, and then format for reuse in an ebook, and then
When does it
format.
end? Yeah.
It doesn't end, and I think that the work, as Jean described it, it really is repetitive. It's error prone. It's time consuming, and it's costly, and that's not where we want to be. That we need actually, and this is very different from the argument that content should be cheap, or that we should find the outsource something to a country that can do it for pennies on the dollar. I'm just the opposite. I'm really saying content should be really high quality and worth reading, worth consuming, and structured in a way so that people understand what to do with it. That requires an investment in process and workflow, and then you drive the costs out of the system. Because you're paying people to do the right things rather than do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, somebody said, the definition of insanity.
Yeah, I don't get to say that to clients as often as I might. So we have just a couple minutes left. I mean, maybe I'll start with you, Iris. Closing thoughts. I mean, one thing that you'd love people to take away from this conversation.
Start early and talk to people outside your circle to glean ideas. We mentioned the word agile multiple times. I think that agile for some publishers is very new and very foreign. They need to start becoming friends with people in the developer world that kind of live that life every day in terms of how they approach a product or a service that they develop. So make friends with people in other aspects of the technology space, and jot down the ideas or concepts that interest you, that you think that you can leverage within your own process. At least to just start a conversation. What are developers doing that publishers are not doing that could work? Because at the end of the day, it's all a product or a service. There's no reason why that workflow can't be retuned just because it's a book. So getting away from the idea of a book as a book, a physical printed book, and more as just a package of content, I think will be easier to digest and stretch out to those newer and different concepts that are available in web development and product development and other spaces.
Yeah, and Jean, we have about a minute. What do you think you'd love people to take away from your perspective?
Well, first of all, we should make Pluto a planet again. It's not the non sequitur that you think it is. Don't be afraid to explore. You learn when you explore. You learn what works and what doesn't work. And a lot of publishers have been really reluctant to get outside of that sphere. They're kind of like a cat on foreign territory. They're just kind of making it, and they're going in circles, wider circles and wider circles. But they're still not getting to the point where exploration is like the norm. And that's where they really need to be.
Yeah, I agree. I want to say thank you to both of you for joining me today. This has been a great conversation, and I couldn't have done it without you.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
All right. You guys be well. Now let's do this again sometime soon.
Excellent.
Okay.
Bye, Internet.
Bye-bye.